Australia's record migration boom is squeezing our property supply. Let's discuss which states are going to feel the most price pressure in the coming years. From overseas, interstate, and intrastate migration. The data can make a huge difference to your wealth if you use this correctly. State by state, I'm going to open up state-based migration for the last 5 years, state-based migration forecast for the next 10 years, housing supply shortfall forecasts for each state, correlation between population growth and price growth, and so much more ahead. We are talking interstate migration first, and it's clear that the Sunshine State is winning the game of interstate migration, with Queensland over the last 5 years moving very strongly. It's clear that that trend has been the highest, not just in a singular year, but over the last 5 years overall, every year. Now, when it comes to Queensland, in the recent FY 22-23, Queensland actually saw over 32,000 people move in internally. Now, internal migration data is a little bit different than the overseas, because with overseas, the data is clear that most people, when they move in rent. But with interstate, there are people who can cross-border purchase or even cross-border rent, but for a short time until they feel like they've got what they wanted, or maybe they move back even. So like the movements are definitely much more defined, and their ability to make decisions are a little bit higher than those coming from overseas who definitely tend to rent for longer. Now, in saying that though, it's important to make sure you're not looking at trends of migration and using these trends to think that they're massive impactors of house price growth in isolation. We'll talk more about those impactors later today and where they make a difference and where they don't. But the key is to remember, Queensland is a huge state. And in the last year, we had that 32,000 uptick of internal migration. It's a huge state, and 32,000 people is a very small number as a comparison to the state's population. So whilst the trend lines Queensland wins out of all the state, and whilst it's the highest, just remember about actual number impact versus how many people are in Queensland versus how many properties and dwellings are in Queensland. It's not as big as what everyone thinks, right? So just be mindful of that when it comes to interstate migration specifically. It's not as big as overseas migrants coming in as a volume number, right? So that's key to remember. Now, looking at the interstate, when it comes to the weaker ones, the weakest was by far New South Wales. And that's not a new trend. Many people think that maybe it's just a COVID thing, things are expensive. New South Wales and even parts of Victoria have actually been some of the weaker markets of migration internally for years. I mean, some cities have been negative for close to 20 years, yet they still have house price growth because of the whole overseas part. So we're looking at them together, it's important. But in isolation, internal migration has been very weak in New South Wales and to an extent Vic for many parts of it, but mainly New South Wales over the whole 5-year period. Vic was pretty good during that sort of 18-19 period. It was more 2020 post-COVID. And look, I won't go into politics, but you can see post-COVID there was a very big change in Vic than there was pre-COVID. But over here, New South Wales has always been weak for internal migration. Now, if we move over to overseas migration, here's where you've got your two breadwinners. New South Wales and Victoria definitely carry the lion's share. Now, we can clearly see that with these two markets, it's the overseas airports, it's the size of the population, it's the traffic at the airports, which is a whole other topic on its own. Airport traffic does have some interesting data points that positively impacts property price points. So keep an eye on those trends. But when it comes to migration and isolation, you can see both Victoria and New South Wales were winners pre-COVID and post-COVID when it comes to overseas migration. In terms of their strength, in the last year alone for FY 22-23, 174,000 net new migrants coming into the New South Wales space and 154,000 net new migrants coming into Victoria. So that's close to 330,000 just alone in those two states, which is definitely the majority. Queensland comes in at third with 83,000 in the last FY, and WA in the fourth position. So they are centering down from their major markets, like the two biggest cities are in New South Wales and Victoria, the third and fourth being in Queensland and WA. So that airport traffic, that flow from overseas airports, that's definitely an impactor. Now, bonus tip for those who have made it this far to the episode is that you actually should keep an eye out on announcements of airlines and movements as well. Because remember, New South Wales and Victoria has been our biggest recipients forever based on these charts. But there can be little micro movements and announcements that happen. For example, Bundaberg is a city where they're looking at announcing micro airlines, and they might have announced it recently with Bonza, and these smaller airlines are taking in more local traffic internally, not for necessarily moving in, although some people use that, but more so travel tourism is a great impactor of airport passenger movements, and then airport passenger movements impacting property prices as well in a positive way. So we've seen these trends, and if you see, like, for example, recently Adelaide just announced, I think at the time of recording this, that they would have Emirates start to operate daily flights from there. Now, the flow-on impact was, millions of dollars on economic boost, but also the flow-on impact was having hundreds of jobs created around certain divisions to cater to that. So the key thing is that airport movements can actually sometimes be an important factor, and even more important than the actual migration thing from an immediate move, because they immediately actually impacted, whereas migration still has human decisions that might flow onto whether they purchase, whether they rent. But with airport passenger movements, there's immediate movement with spending data in local markets, and even international airport movements when they start. So keep an eye out for announcements. And usually I find the best way to keep track of those announcements is premiers. They love to take credit for every move that happens, right? So why not follow those premier and their social pages across the nation to start seeing what things are coming up. That's a great little tip I have whilst you're on this data. So just talking overseas migration, those are the past 5-year trends, and it's clear New South Wales and Victoria were the strongest, and they will likely be forever unless we're unlocking way more airport traffic and way more, partnerships with other countries and having other cities more popular globally, right? Imagine as another opera house being built in Adelaide or something, right? That for sure attract a lot more postcards, a lot more people from overseas. That's different. So I think the main thing though is that now that we know those trends of the past, what are some of the forecasts? Well, the forecast charts here are interesting. I think there's a clear consensus here in the Center for Population that 2024 will be another big year for migration. And it's likely that after the 2024 year in 25, things tend to calm down. Now, when I take a step back to understand why they might calm down, there could be multiple reasons here. The first reason is that the actual intervention of our country may step in. The governments may go, look, we're bringing in a lot of people. I think we've caught up our losses from the period of COVID where we'd locked in, and we've gotten back to averages. We'd like to sustain this, and they might have caps on processing of certain passports, certain visas, certain travels. So there just becomes a cap due to intervention. Or another part could be where people's desires are, right? Right now, we are the lucky country, and the lucky country from people coming in for lifestyle, people coming into a stable economic environment, a strong economic environment, safety, and also starting to see the resilience of asset prices here and how they've been with housing, right? So all of these things are great. But the main thing here is that there is a lot of, people coming in over the next year forecast. In 2025, it starts to slow down. And whether that's intervention or whether that's the actual just people feeling a little bit different about coming here now than before, that's a TBC. The main thing it seems like is that it's more the intervention piece or more the desire to not have that number continue. Now, I'm of the opinion migration will stay pretty strong. Now, it won't be as strong as it is now forever, but it will have to stay pretty strong, not for the reasons of COVID or playing catch up, but because, unlike, other parts of the world where they might have certain younger populations, we actually have a population that will start to age around the 2030s pretty seriously and pretty quickly. And you can see in case studies across the world of what an aging population can do, whether it be assets passing down, whether it be a workforce, whether it be types of job that don't any longer exist or have a shortage of because people go into retirement in bulk. I think there's a lot of flow and impacts there, whether it be certain citizens that do less as a productivity measure from employment, wages, work, output. Naturally, these change as your life changes. So a lot of interesting data on that, and I encourage you to check it out, and the impacts of overseas migration on the aging population, because actually it's bringing down the average age of Australia, because you're not waiting for births and deaths to catch up. You're inserting new population of younger people sooner and each year. So that's kind of the core things that migration does, and they may be a key strategy of the government longer term to counteract some of those negative implications of aging population. Now, if we're coming back to the forecast from the Centre of Population, not for overseas data, but coming back for interstate data, it's clear that the belief is still that New South Wales will see the drain of people move over, and it looks like Queensland will continue to be the recipient. 19,200 per annum departures from New South Wales is expected, with that same actual positive trend going into Queensland. Victoria will seem to recover based on the trends here and the forecasts ahead in terms of their per annum trend, with 3,400 returning. So I don't know if the Centre of Population is looking at, whether it be leadership data or whether it be other trends that they're noticing in Victoria, but they're definitely seeing Victoria start to recover again. Queensland definitely the clear winner, and has been over the last 5 years, and is expected to be for the next 10 years on a per annum basis. But then looking at other things that are positive, was the ups and downs of South Australia seem to be behind us, and there's expectations that that migration will look to continue to strengthen, with 3,600 per annum coming into South Australia. Not a huge number, but still there. What I found interesting was that there are beliefs that the interstate migration for WA from the Centre of Population will really fall off, which is unique and interesting because it was actually one of the very strong ones over the recent times. And I definitely do feel the affordability of WA is playing a massive positive part for the actual migration strength in recent times. But there are beliefs here from the Centre of Population that that migration will really come off and will start to slow again. Could that be because the price growth here really starts to come back up again and it's no longer affordable in some cases? Could that be just because, the job prospects are expected to weaken? I'm unsure about that one. I'm of the opinion that that maybe shouldn't be so weak, and it should be stronger than that forecast there. But they're of the belief that this might be the last big year of migration ahead before things start to calm down. We'll wait and see for how that goes. But from the Centre of Population, that's some of the forecasts for internal migration, with Queensland leading the way and Victoria recovering, South Australia strengthening, New South Wales coming backwards again as usual. NT also continuing to decline, and ACT as well, whilst we see the state of WA flatten out. Now, that is the actual forecast from overseas and looking at it from interstate. The next chart I want to bring up is actually start to go through the actual demand and supply trends of new supply. Now, this has been done by the Housing Institute of Australia, and this data was interesting because it goes into some of our major cities. Now, firstly, looking at this trend, there's a few things starting to come in. What they're looking at is household supply in terms of supply additions, construction supply that is, and looking at that in comparison to household formation and the actual change in the number of dwellings required. What's clearly being seen here across all the markets is that 2025 and 2026, there is a deficiency across markets like Sydney. That's the first one. So what we can see here is that household formation is really going to rise, which means that we're going to continue to see more and more households coming into play. And that means there will be the same people but spread across more houses there. And so if that formation continues to come up and we're not having new supply addition meet the market, we're seeing a significant shortfall in the number of dwellings in comparisons to the households formed, which is clearly evident from 25 all the way to 29, although the biggest years of deficiency by Housing Institute of Australia is likely to be 2025 and 2026. Now, if you take that trend and you bring it over to Melbourne, the trends are slightly different. The same trends in terms of the deficiencies expected, but that deficiency will go on as well to 27, 28, but a little bit longer all the way through to 32 and 33. So this is a big deficiency. It looks like Melbourne's next decade will be much more deficient than, say, Sydney will, but at least over the next few years, they'll both be pretty high in terms of the deficiency. Now, this is meaning that we're just going to have more households forming in comparison to the supply addition of construction specifically. It's not all supply additions, because remember, the biggest driver to supply is not construction. It's actually how many established houses for sale come up for sale. And as we know right now in Australia, there's about a 30 to 50% reduction in house for sale across many cities, and only just a couple of our biggest cities that are more unbalanced, right? So what this means is the new part of housing is going to be falling behind. And if we're talking about migrants coming in from overseas, that's not an immediate need, but in the years ahead, they may want to form even more households. Their net new population, therefore the construction of new houses is going to be lagging a fair bit and causing that deficiency, at least definitely for the whole decade in Melbourne from their forecasts, and in Sydney for half the decade. If we go to other cities like Brisbane, the severe shortage of construction supply isn't as much. And look, that's been fairly common with the available land across many parts of Brisbane. Again, that doesn't mean in isolation that that's going to impact prices, because we do know that housing supply established is a bigger driver. It's clear that new supply additions will be in shortfall for the next couple of years, but just not as deep as the likes of Sydney and Melbourne when we're talking about a longer period of time. The deficiency does come off in Brisbane and does come to a positive over 29 and 2030, which means that we should see housing from a construction level come back into play. Now, if we're going to Adelaide, the deficiency has remained there the most over the last few years and will continue till 2026, but it seems to be a quick recovery over 27 and 28. And I think this may be due to the fact that there's a little bit more affordable land and land releases in the outer parts of Adelaide, and the subdivision, in terms of what we've seen, in terms of like the smaller land lots, is actually a little bit more available here in terms of their town planning. We've noticed that in trends as well in comparison to some other states. And I think if you start to extend that out in terms of the northeast and the south, there's definitely space, and that to an affordable price to do so. So I think that deficiency can recover quicker in later parts, but right now it's still in play till 2026. And so this continues to go on into Perth as well. But Perth was interesting. The Perth deficiency is again expected to 26, but it has the largest positive trend from 28 onwards. There is no other major city that will have as large of a positive trend, which means, could this be the return of that Perth up and down that we saw in construction? Because it's been there for the last sort of 20 years. We see huge swings of construction come in, and then we see construction fall off, and another return of huge construction. Well, the predictions from the Housing Institute of Australia is that there were the deficiencies over the last 5 years expected for the next 2, and we're going to see the deficiencies quickly resolve themselves, construction specifically, from 28 and at large volumes for the next 5 years afterwards. Now, that again has to be linked back to established housing, but it's clear that the Housing Institute of Australia feels that 2028 onwards seems to be the big recovery in construction versus household requirements in Perth. So that'll be interesting to wait and watch. Lastly, if we move over to Hobart, it follows a similar trend of Perth in 2029 onwards with the big recovery, but the deficiency is pretty deep in 25 and 26 in Hobart. Now, I won't go through the rest of the cities. There are many other capital cities there, but this does show that in terms of the dwelling construction piece, if the migration keeps pouring in, combined with household formation, we are in for some major dwelling deficiency in the construction angle. And so that means that if we continue to see established supply for sale and established supply for rent remain tight, and you put on top of that construction supply and the dwelling deficiency being tight, then the next couple of years are still looking like some undersupply across many parts of Australia. But it was interesting to see the second half of the decade that there are a couple of cities that jump into positive, like Perth and like Hobart, but then we start to see some cities remain pretty negative, like Melbourne, through the second half of the decade. So we'll wait and watch for those sorts of things to come through. Now, when we're looking at correlation, this is the next part to look at for migration, because migration trends are exciting to talk about. There's brain drains in some areas, there's people coming in like no tomorrow in another, airports flying and booming. The airports don't fly, the planes do, but the airports are booming, and then people talking about migration booms and people on the social media loving it, hating it. Things go crazy. but is the buzz for migration in isolation as big as it should be for house price growth correlation? Now let's look into the charts. The first chart I want to bring up here is actually going to be Greater Sydney. And with Greater Sydney, we're going to start to talk about the migration rates. We obviously know population growth rates in Sydney are pretty high. Now, in the first chart, it's the green line. And if you're not able to see the green lines and you listen to this podcast, jump on our YouTube page, hit like and subscribe to see more videos like this, but also check out the YouTube page where you see some of the data here on this. And that's the InvestorKit YouTube page if it's your first time tuning in. Population growth rates in Sydney have been pretty high and have continued high, but in waves. So the first big jumps was between 0.5% going up from 2003 all the way to 2008. And that 2008 period was like by far the biggest sort of period of migration in recent times in Sydney. That fell off post GFC to about 2011 and then continued to remain these strong numbers all the way to 2017. But 2017 to 2021, that really weakened. In recent times, that's jumping back up again, but 2017 to 2021 was a big weakening. Now, when you start to see these trends emerge, it's not a perfect trend line for growth correlation. You can see that in 2008, house prices for Sydney and their growth rates were actually negative, even though we had the booming population, right? So that's huge. Now, you may argue, well, Arjun, what about the lag effect? Well, true, that could happen because you could see here that in 2010, house prices rose a fair bit in Sydney, but in that rise that happened in terms of growth rates, it was short-lived. Now, migration came down, right? We saw that population growth rate from 2017 all the way to 2021 decline heavily, but the price growth went up. So you can see there is no perfect correlation here for migration and price growth. We can see some signals of a lagged trend emerging in terms of Sydney, but overall, if this was the case, when population growth was very low, when borders closed, when population growth was trending down from 2019, we saw that big jump in price growth. From 2004 all the way to 2008, population growth year on year continued to increase. Why was Sydney house prices not growing a lot? And even if you put the lagged effect in there, it wasn't a clear correlation. Now, this isn't just the only city we analyzed. We went further. This next one, we'll look at Melbourne. So Melbourne's population growth rate was actually very high and continued to stay high all the way from 2003 at above 1%, going through to 2017 where it remained high at over 2%. So a huge number, getting close to 3% there. What you can see is that the population trend line, you can draw a straight line other than 2011 with a small dip, but that straight line up did not see ups for the whole house price growth. There was zigzags in price growth whilst population continued to move up from that period. So there wasn't any perfect correlation trend being seen as well. Let's go through Greater Brisbane, the sunshine state that's receiving all the love in the media, all the good weather, and everyone's saying that their best mates have gone over to the Gold Coast or Brisbane and moved out this way. Well, we're talking Brisbane specifically, and what we can see here is that population growth rates were very strong throughout many years from 2003 to 2013. They did come down a little bit, but there were still very strong trends. However, in that time period, after that initial boom of 2000 and 2005, house price growth really calmed down. In fact, even when population growth numbers, whilst not growing as much as the earlier decade, were still strong between 2012 and 2020, that percentage rate that was still strong did not realize any house price growth of any significance from 2012 to 2020. So you can see here that even though migration was healthy, obviously it wasn't booming in 2012 to 2020 for Queensland, it was still very healthy. We saw Brisbane just did not boom during that period, even when that migration was very healthy. These next two examples are going to be very interesting, and they are Perth and Hobart. If not, in my opinion, the most perfect points to recognize that migration is not that clear correlation piece with house price growth. We can see Perth migration and population growth trends. Population growth trends here for Perth were extremely high between 2010 all the way to 2013. It was averaging some of the highest in the nation, sort of between that, again, 2.5% to 3.5%. Now, during that time, the median price growth trend started to fall off and decline. And as you know, Perth started declining. Yes, population did follow afterwards because of that weaker economic situation, but the prices were already falling off before, even as population was high in that state. So with Hobart, what we can see, which was interesting, was there was a big population boom between 2016 and 2019 in terms of percentage growth rates. And during that time, house price trends were definitely picking up. But from the trends themselves, they weren't super clear in the years prior. Like if we go back to 2003 and 4, migration was very weak in Hobart, but then actual price growth was phenomenal, right? So it just shows that yes, there can be periods where both occur, like Hobart had between 16 and 19. House price growth continued to trend up and it was pretty healthy, and a population boom was occurring. But in the years in the past, that wasn't the case. So we can't always put these two together and say that 1 and 1 equals 2. And this is the key thing to remember with correlation. So it's an impactor, it's positive, but we also have to look at it with all summer things when looking at the data of population growth, migration, and prices together. Now, in terms of some of the capital cities, the last 5 years, intrastate data, we talked about intrastate and interstate, and some interesting trends are forming. Now, there was some data missing here with ABS between sort of June 21 and December 21, and this could have been just after that COVID period with what happened. But when it comes to the net intrastate migration and interstate migration, there are some massive trends emerging. The first thing that's clear is Melbourne. If we're looking at Melbourne intrastate and interstate, intrastate migration really started to pick up a little bit in Melbourne towards sort of lockdown and afterwards. So we saw that pick up and means that people were leaving Melbourne for other parts of Victoria. But the biggest factor was the interstate migration. From 2020, we saw that fall off massively up until 21, and then 22 that started to recover again. What that meant was the amount of people leaving Melbourne and Victoria as a whole, or leaving Melbourne and going outside of Victoria was huge, but leaving Melbourne and going out to other parts of Victoria was also improving. So I think the key thing here is that we can see that the Melbourners were having a rough time post-COVID because those trends really went the other way around. If we have a look at Brisbane, so with Brisbane, this is another interesting one. We can firstly see that Brisbane trends just before the lockdown started improving, and this is where people were actually going interstate. And so by improving, it's Brisbane being the recipient of interstate migration. But then when COVID started to hit, Brisbane continued its strength in the interstate, but when it comes to intrastate, we can see Brisbane weakened. So less people within Queensland were coming to Brisbane, and I think there's a lot of lifestyle elements in different parts of Queensland, but when it comes to people going from other states to Brisbane, that was definitely a positive. So we can see that COVID had that impact on Brisbane in two ways. Outside of Queensland definitely came through to Brisbane a lot more, but then within Queensland, there was appreciation for other parts of Queensland more than there was for Brisbane from people within Queensland, which is just interesting to see that when you break down the Melbourne and Brisbane as two examples, the trends just were really, really different based on what Melbourne and Victoria had versus what Brisbane and Queensland had. Shows the importance of, the within city environment leadership, state-based economic environments, and actually how people just feel about a certain city and a certain state, its leadership. It's clear that, what the impacts were from whether it be lockdowns, whether it be the policies. COVID was a massive shifter for Melbourne, what was occurring there. House prices, jobs, all these different factors factored into Melbourne and what happened with interstate and intrastate. There are many other cities here that show various trends, but I think these two ones were the big ones to call out to say that Brisbane was definitely somewhere popular from interstate, but intrastate, it started losing a bit of love. And then Melbourne was definitely a big loser from interstate and intrastate, but intrastate is starting to recover a little bit with more people coming back to Melbourne. But really, I think the main thing is that these migration trends show what can happen on the micro and just give you a bit of insight as to overseas, interstate, intrastate, and its correlation In some parts of it stronger, some parts of it weaker. So if you like this migration deep dive and try to understand where the forecasts are and how that aids you in the housing journey, and you want to see more episodes like this where we go deep into the data like we did today, taking you through forecasts, last 5-year metrics, correlation, and even things like we break down a singular metric set light migration into many smaller points, interstate, intrastate, and overseas, well, drop us a like and subscribe, and maybe even a comment for more ideas where we can respond to those questions and ideas that you have on our YouTube page or our reviews. If you enjoyed content like this on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, give us a share to your friends and family as well who are keen to learn more about the property market in 2024 and get informed ahead.